Since 1957, America had had an unmanned space program. Starting in 1959, we had a manned space program. The first 7 astronauts were chosen in 1959. They were called the Mercury 7. The first manned space program was called the Mercury program. It involved the first space capsule, the first American space capsule at any rate. The astronaut was placed inside of it. It was called a capsule because you were encapsulated. It was like being inside a pill. The astronaut was sitting up, facing forward during flight, but for launch and landing, he was actually laying on his back. The space capsule was fairly small, and being inside of it was a little bit of a claustrophobic experience, but it was America's first manned space program. The first rocket used to launch that capsule was called the Redstone booster. It was a solid fuel rocket. The fuel was not liquid inside of it. It was packed in solid. It was very quickly accelerating, so it shot up quicker than many other rockets. Put a lot of G-forces on the astronaut, who was squashed back into his seat during takeoff and launch. Alan Shepard got to be the first American in space. Early 1961, he crawled into his capsule, which was on top of that Redstone booster, and up he went. He had a suborbital flight plan, which meant that he basically went up and down, and that was it. It was a very short flight, only lasted about 15-20 minutes. The next step was a bigger booster, a bigger rocket, same capsule at the top, the Mercury space capsule, but this was called the Atlas booster, and it was much larger. After the Mercury program was done, the next program was called the Gemini program. It had a capsule that seated 2 astronauts. It was placed on top of a booster called the Titan, which was larger still. Spacewalking became a thing, the first time human beings could float free in space during the Gemini program. Finally, the Apollo project. This was the biggest rocket ever made. To this day, it still is the largest and most powerful rocket made. It's called the Saturn V. The Apollo capsule had room for 3 astronauts, and the first Apollo flight was in 1968. On top of that big Saturn V rocket was not only the Apollo capsule with 3 astronauts inside, there was also a device known as the Lunar Lander, the LEM for short, and the third item up on top of that big rocket was the service module, which basically contained extra oxygen, rocket fuel, etc., etc. All 3 of these flew together to the moon. The service module and command module stayed in orbit around the moon, while the lunar lander itself landed on the moon, and so it was that human beings were able to set foot on the moon.